There are moments in your life that are not measured by the ticking of a clock, but by the density of the silence that fills them. They are rooms you enter, where the air grows thick and heavy, and the simple act of breathing becomes a conscious effort. Time doesn't stop in these moments, but it stretches, pulling taut like a thread about to snap, holding within its tension the weight of every possible future. This was one of those moments. Liam stood by the door of my apartment, his hand on the knob, his jacket halfway onto his shoulders. He had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, caught in the amber of the low lamplight, a perfect sculpture of indecision. He had come over to drop off a book he'd borrowed, a simple, 5-minute transaction that had somehow unspooled into 3 hours of conversation, then comfortable silence, and now this. This unbearable, beautiful, terrifying pause. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the scuffed floorboards just beyond his feet, as if they held the answer to a question he was afraid to ask. The city hummed its distant, indifferent lullaby 10 floors below, a sound that usually soothed me, but now served only to amplify the profound quiet within my living room. I could hear the faint buzz of the refrigerator, the whisper of my own blood in my ears. Every tiny detail of the scene was etched into my mind with a hyper-realistic clarity. The way the light caught the frayed edge of his gray hoodie peeking out from under his jacket, the specific pattern of creases on the back of his neck, the tension in the set of his jaw. He had picked up his jacket to leave, a simple, declarative act. But he hadn't left. He had stayed, poised on the threshold between my world and the one outside, and his stillness was louder than any words he could have spoken. My own body was a traitor, a live wire of hope and dread. I remained on the couch, my book lying forgotten in my lap, my fingers clenched around its cover. I willed myself to be still, to not give away the chaotic storm raging inside my chest. For years, my relationship with Liam had been a carefully curated exhibition of platonic friendship. I was the curator, the quiet guardian of its boundaries, meticulously maintaining the space between us to protect the fragile, precious thing we had. But more than that, I was protecting myself. Because somewhere along the way, in the thousands of hours we had spent in easy companionship, my heart had committed the ultimate act of treason. I had fallen in love with my best friend. And now, in this stretched and silent moment, it felt as if the entire structure I had so carefully built was threatening to collapse. I wanted to break the silence. I wanted to say something easy, something normal. Did you forget something? Or drive safe? But the words were stuck in my throat, tangled in the desperate hope that this pause meant what I prayed it meant. That he was hesitating not because he was tired or lost in thought, but because he was standing on the edge of a confession, gathering the courage to take a leap. The air was charged with it, with the energy of the unspoken. It felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when the sky turns a strange shade of green and the world holds its breath. He shifted his weight, the leather of his jacket groaning softly, and the sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. He finally lifted his head, but he still didn't look at me. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the photographs I had pinned to a corkboard, on the stack of vinyl records by the stereo, on the worn-out armchair in the corner. It was as if he were trying to memorize the space, or perhaps seeing it for the first time. And in his gaze, I saw a profound loneliness, a weariness that seemed to settle deep in his bones. It was a look I had come to know well over the past few months, a shadow that clung to him ever since Sarah had left. But this was different. This wasn't just the residual ache of a breakup. This felt deeper, more immediate. It was the loneliness of someone standing at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take, and terrified of taking it alone. My heart ached for him, a familiar, painful throb. I wanted to go to him, to wrap my arms around him and tell him that he wasn't alone, that he never had to be. But I was paralyzed by the fear of misinterpretation, the lifelong terror of seeing a door that was only open a crack and flinging it wide, only to find an empty room on the other side. So I waited. I let the silence stretch, giving it the space it seemed to demand, hoping it would shape itself into an answer. He finally turned his head, and his eyes met mine across the room. The exhaustion was there, yes, but underneath it, there was something else. A vulnerability so raw and open it stole the breath from my lungs. It was a look that stripped away all the layers of easy charm and casual confidence he wore like a second skin. In that moment, he was just Liam. Not the star sprinter of our college swim team, not the brilliant young consultant who could command a boardroom, but just a man, lost and searching, his heart laid bare in his gaze. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. A flicker of conflict, of fear, crossed his face. He took a half step back towards the door, his hand tightening on the knob, and my stomach plummeted. This was it. The moment was passing. He was going to leave, and the silence would collapse back into normalcy, leaving me alone with the ghosts of what might have been. But then he stopped. He let out a slow, shuddering breath, and his shoulders slumped in a gesture of utter defeat, or perhaps of surrender. He let his hand fall from the doorknob. He didn't move towards me, but he didn't move away, either. He just stood there, in the space between coming and going, and looked at me as if I were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the carefully curated exhibition was over. The walls were coming down. We had met in the water, which always felt fitting. The chlorine-scented, echoing natatorium at university was a world unto itself, a blue-tiled sanctuary where the outside world fell away, and all that mattered was the rhythm of your own breath and the pull of your arms through the water. I was a distance swimmer, built for endurance and solitude. My entire being was geared toward finding a steady, meditative pace and holding it for what felt like an eternity. I found a quiet comfort in the long, lonely black line at the bottom of the pool, in the muffled silence beneath the surface. Liam was the opposite. He was a sprinter, a creature of explosive power and raw energy. His races were over in a blur of churning water and desperate, gasping breaths. He lived for the adrenaline, the roar of the sparse crowd, the violent slam of his hand against the touchpad. He burned bright and fast, while I was a slow, steady burn. On paper, we should have orbited in different universes. My life was a collection of quiet, solitary pursuits, photography, long walks with no destination, losing myself in the library stacks. His was a whirlwind of social events, team parties, and a seemingly endless parade of friends who were drawn to his magnetic energy. He was the sun. I was the quiet planet content to exist in its distant, steady warmth. But the pool was the great equalizer. It stripped everyone down to the same cap and goggles, the same shared exhaustion. And it was in that state of shared depletion that our friendship took root. It began with him collapsing into the lane next to mine after a particularly brutal sprint set, his chest heaving and muttering, "I think I just saw God," and he was holding a stopwatch. I'd laughed, a real, genuine laugh that surprised even me, and offered him my water bottle. From there, it became a ritual. We were always the last two to leave the locker room, moving with the slow, aching stiffness of athletes who had pushed their bodies to the absolute limit. We'd walk back towards the dorms together, the cold night air a welcome shock to our overheated skin. Our conversations started simply, post-mortems of the practice, complaints about our coach, speculation about the next meet. But gradually, they deepened. He would talk about the pressure from his father to succeed, the dizzying array of expectations he felt he had to live up to. I, in turn, found myself opening up in ways I never had before. I told him about my quiet ambition to be a photographer, to capture the small, unnoticed moments of beauty in the world. He was the first person who didn't just nod politely but asked to see my work, who looked at my grainy black and white photos with a genuine, unfeigned interest. He saw the world in bold, vibrant colors. I saw it in light and shadow. And somehow, our perspectives complemented each other perfectly. He started showing up at my dorm room, initially under the pretext of studying for a shared economics class. He'd arrive with a stack of books and a restless energy that filled my small, quiet space. But more often than not, the books would remain closed. We'd talk for hours, or he'd just lie on my floor, staring at the ceiling, and talk himself out until he was empty. My room became his sanctuary, a place where he didn't have to be the charismatic team captain or the life of the party. He could just be Liam, tired and uncertain. And I became his anchor, the quiet presence that allowed him to be still. For my part, he was a window to a world I was too introverted to enter on my own. He'd bring the world to me, recounting stories from parties, introducing me to his wide circle of friends, gently pulling me out of my shell without ever making me feel pressured or uncomfortable. He made me feel seen, not as the quiet, awkward swimmer, but as Leo, his friend. I can pinpoint the exact moment the tectonic plates of my heart shifted. It was a Tuesday night in our junior year. We were watching some mindless action movie on my laptop, huddled on my narrow dorm bed. A midterm-induced exhaustion had settled over both of us. Halfway through the film, I felt a weight against my shoulder. I glanced over and saw that Liam had fallen asleep, his head resting against me, his breathing deep and even. His usual restless energy was gone, replaced by a profound and trusting stillness. The faint scent of chlorine still clung to his hair. The movie played on, a meaningless cacophony of explosions and dialogue, but I couldn't hear it. All I could hear was the soft sound of his breathing. All I could feel was the solid, warm weight of him against me. It was such a simple thing, a moment of unguarded trust between friends. But in that moment, something inside me broke open. It was a feeling so immense and terrifyingly tender that it felt like a physical ache in my chest. It was the quiet, devastating realization that the careful architecture of my world had just been rebuilt around this single, sleeping boy. From that day forward, I became a student of emotional architecture, constructing an elaborate fortress around my feelings. The friendship was too precious to risk. The thought of his easy affection curdling into awkwardness or pity was more than I could bear. So I built walls. I became the perfect confidant, the supportive friend. I listened as he talked about the girls he was dating, offering advice with a carefully neutral expression while my insides twisted into knots. I met his first serious girlfriend, Jessica, and smiled and shook her hand, telling Liam later that she seemed wonderful, a lie that felt like swallowing glass. I perfected the art of casual, non-threatening physical contact, a quick pat on the back, a playful shove, all to create the illusion that the profound comfort I took in his proximity was nothing more than simple camaraderie. I learned to live in the space between what I felt and what I showed, a constant, low-level hum of longing that became the soundtrack to my life. His relationship with Sarah was the hardest. It lasted for 2 years, stretching beyond graduation and into the start of our adult lives. She was smart and ambitious, and, from what I could tell, she truly loved him. And he seemed happy. They moved in together, they talked about the future. I played my part, attending their housewarming party, bringing a bottle of wine and a carefully chosen photograph I had framed for them. I watched them interact, a seamless unit of shared jokes and easy intimacy, and I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life I desperately wished was my own. I told myself that his happiness was all that mattered, and I think, on some level, I even believed it. If I couldn't have him, I could at least be the friend who stood by him, a fixed point in his ever-changing universe. I would be his anchor, even if it meant I could never, ever let him see the true depth of the ocean he was tethered to. My love for him became a form of quiet endurance, a long-distance swim against an invisible current, with no finish line in sight. The shift, when it came, was not a gentle tremor but a seismic event. It was the phone call I received on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was Liam, his voice thick and broken in a way I had never heard before. He could barely get the words out. Sarah had left him. It wasn't just a breakup, it was a detonation. She had been seeing someone else, a colleague from her law firm, and had packed her things while he was on a business trip. He had come home to a half-empty apartment and a letter on the kitchen counter. The raw, guttural pain in his voice was a physical thing, a shard of ice in my own chest. I told him to stay put, that I was on my way. I broke at least a dozen traffic laws getting to his place, my mind a frantic blur of worry. I found him sitting on the floor of his living room, surrounded by the negative space where her furniture used to be. The apartment, which had always felt so full of life and their shared energy, now echoed with a profound and hollow emptiness. He was just staring at the wall, the letter crumpled in his fist. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of all his usual vibrancy, as if someone had turned off his light. I didn't say anything. I just sat down on the floor next to him, my shoulder pressed against his, and we stayed like that for hours as the rain beat against the windows, two solitary figures in a room full of ghosts. That night, he came back to my apartment. He brought a single duffel bag, as if he were just visiting for the weekend, but we both knew it was more than that. He couldn't bear the emptiness of his own home. That first night set the tone for everything that followed. He didn't want to talk about it, not in detail. He couldn't. The betrayal was too fresh, the wound too deep. He just needed a place to exist where he wasn't suffocated by memories. He took the spare room, but he didn't sleep. I could hear him pacing, the restless, caged energy of a man whose world had been shattered. The following days bled into weeks, and my apartment became his default location. He'd go to work, come straight to my place, and we would fall into a new, somber routine. We'd order takeout, watch movies we didn't really pay attention to, and exist in a shared space of quiet commiseration. The easy, laughing banter that had been the hallmark of our friendship was gone, replaced by long stretches of silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a necessary one, a space for him to grieve without the pressure of performance. I saw a side of Liam I had never seen before. The unknowing initiator, the man who moved through the world with such casual confidence, was gone. In his place was someone fragile, uncertain, and deeply, achingly lonely. He was untethered, and without even thinking about it, he was clinging to his anchor. I tried my best to be what he needed, a steady presence, a patient listener when he did want to talk, a silent companion when he didn't. But I was also acutely aware that the lines of our friendship, lines I had so carefully policed for years, were beginning to blur. He was no longer just my best friend crashing on my couch. He was a man seeking refuge, not just in my home, but in my presence. And the intimacy of that need was both a profound gift and an exquisite form of torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been. But the reason for that closeness was a constant, painful reminder of the chasm that still lay between us. He was healing from the loss of a woman he loved, and I was the one applying the bandages, all while hiding my own bleeding heart. The foundation of our friendship was shifting under our feet, and I had no idea what kind of structure would be left standing when the shaking finally stopped. The ritual began on the couch. It was an old, comfortable thing, deep and worn, the kind of furniture that invites you to sink in and stay. It became our island in the evenings. After a few weeks, the formality of him retreating to the spare room began to dissolve. He was just too exhausted. He started falling asleep on the couch during our nightly movie ritual, his body surrendering to a bone-deep weariness that his mind fought to keep at bay. The first time, I let him be, eventually draping a blanket over him before I went to bed. I stood there for a long time, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest, the way his face, so often tight with a carefully managed stress, was finally relaxed in sleep. The urge to reach out and brush a stray piece of hair from his forehead was so overwhelming it made my fingers ache. I resisted. I maintained the boundary. A few nights later, a chill had settled into the autumn air. I brought out the same thick, woolen blanket. As I unfolded it, he shifted, murmuring something unintelligible. "Just a blanket," I whispered. "You looked cold," he nodded, still half asleep, and as I laid it over him, he moved closer to my end of the couch, a subconscious, instinctual seeking of warmth. He didn't move away. He settled into the new proximity, his shoulder now brushing against mine. My entire nervous system lit up. I was hyper-aware of that single point of contact, the warmth seeping from his body into mine. I sat there, rigid and barely breathing, for the remainder of the film, my mind a frantic catalog of sensation and meaning. This was nothing, I told myself. It was a simple, physiological response to cold. It meant nothing. But my heart, that stubborn, hopeful traitor, insisted it meant everything. This became the new normal. Every night, we would end up on the couch, and the blanket would become a shared space. The initial, accidental proximity became intentional. He would settle in, and without a word, would lean his weight against me. The distance between us, once measured in feet, was now measured in millimeters. Some nights, his head would find its way to my shoulder as he drifted off. I would be left in the darkened room, the blue light of the television flickering across his sleeping face, with the heavy, precious weight of his trust resting on me. I learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way his brow would furrow slightly even in sleep. I learned the scent of his shampoo, a simple, clean smell of sandalwood and something uniquely Liam, a scent that I began to associate with a feeling of profound, heart-stopping peace. It was a sweet agony. I was getting everything I had ever wanted, but it was all under a guise of plausible deniability. He was my grieving friend. I was his source of comfort. To assign any other meaning to these moments would be a selfish, dangerous act of projection. I repeated this mantra to myself over and over, a desperate prayer to keep my own hope in check. The ritual then expanded beyond the couch. He started staying over more nights than he spent at his own empty apartment. The spare room became, for all intents and purposes, his room. My toothbrush holder now held 2 brushes. His running shoes were a permanent fixture by my door. Our lives were intertwining in a way that felt both deeply natural and incredibly precarious. And then came the detail that my overanalytical mind seized upon with an obsessive focus: the door. Every night, when he would finally peel himself off the couch and shuffle to the spare room, he would leave the door ajar. Not wide open, but not closed. Just a crack, a sliver of an opening that allowed the dim light from the hallway to cut a thin line across his floor. I would lie awake in my own bed, my own door also open, and I would stare at that sliver of light from his room. It became a symbol, a question mark hanging in the quiet darkness of my apartment. Why did he leave it open? Was it a simple, practical habit, a way to navigate an unfamiliar space in the dark? Or was it something more? Was it an unconscious signal, a lowering of a barrier, an invitation into a space that was not just physical, but emotional? My mind would race, constructing elaborate theories. Perhaps he was afraid of the total darkness, a childish fear that felt plausible given his current fragile state. Perhaps he wanted to be able to hear if I moved around, a subconscious need for the reassurance of my presence. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that made my heart beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs, perhaps it was a door he was leaving open for me. This nightly ritual, on the couch and with the door, became the central focus of my existence. My life was divided into 2 distinct states: the anxious, hopeful anticipation of the evening, and the quiet, analytical post-mortem of the morning after. During the day, I would go through the motions of my life, but my thoughts were constantly circling back to him, to the meaning of a sigh, the weight of a hand, the angle of an open door. I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was also the primary suspect, potentially fabricating all the evidence from the raw material of my own desperate yearning. It was a period of intense, quiet intimacy and profound, isolating loneliness. He was closer to me than ever, yet the most important thing, the truth of my feelings, remained a universe away, locked behind a door I was too terrified to open. He was the unknowing initiator, constantly pushing at boundaries he didn't even seem to realize were there. And I was the quiet observer, watching, waiting, and drowning slowly in the beautiful, terrible ambiguity of it all. The tension had been building for weeks, a quiet, atmospheric pressure that had become the new climate of my apartment. The couch ritual was no longer an accident or a matter of convenience. It was an expectation, an unspoken agreement. The moment the movie started, he would settle against me, and my body would instinctively accommodate his, a lock accepting its key. The pretense of platonic comfort had worn so thin it was transparent. We were, for all intents and purposes, cuddling every night. We were sharing a level of physical intimacy that existed far outside the normal bounds of male friendship, yet we never, ever spoke of it. The silence on the matter was a fragile bubble, and we were both terrified of being the one to pop it. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the heaven of his closeness and the hell of its ambiguity. That night, the air felt different, thicker. A storm had rolled in, and the sound of rain lashing against the windows created an even deeper sense of insulation from the outside world. We were on the couch, the credits of the movie we had barely watched rolling up the screen, casting a pale, shifting light across the room. The usual moment of transition, where one of us would stir and declare it was time for bed, never came. We just sat there, tangled together under the familiar wool blanket, listening to the rain and the sound of each other's breathing. His head was on my shoulder, his arm draped loosely across my chest. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against my ribs, a rhythm that seemed to be in perfect sync with my own. The silence wasn't empty this time. It was full. It was packed with all the questions we hadn't asked and all the answers we were afraid to hear. He shifted, slowly, deliberately. He pushed himself up, propping his weight on one elbow so he could look down at me. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The bubble was about to burst. His face was close, so close I could see the faint flecks of gold in his brown eyes, even in the dim, flickering light. His expression was one I had never seen before. It was a terrifying mix of vulnerability, determination, and a deep, soul-shaking fear. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide if the fall would kill him or teach him how to fly. My own breath was caught somewhere in my throat, a painful, immovable knot. I could do nothing but look back at him, my own fear and hope warring for dominance in my eyes. The entire world seemed to shrink until it consisted of nothing but the few inches of charged air between our faces. Leo? His voice was a rough whisper, barely more than a breath, but it shattered the silence. The sound of my name on his lips in that moment was a physical thing, a touch. I couldn't form a response. I could only watch him, my insides trembling. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a fragile, desperate resolve. He was going to jump. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The words hung in the air between us, impossibly gentle, impossibly huge. They were not the words of a confident seducer, but the tentative, hopeful plea of someone laying down all their weapons, offering up their own vulnerability as a form of truce. All the anxiety, all the years of careful analysis and second-guessing, all the fear of misreading the signs, it all evaporated in the face of that one, devastatingly honest question. He was giving me the choice. He was giving me all the power. He wasn't assuming or taking. He was asking. And in that question, he was offering me a truth more profound than any I had dared to imagine. He saw it too. He felt it too. I wasn't crazy. I opened my mouth to say yes, to shout yes, but no sound came out. My throat was tight with a tidal wave of emotion that had been held back for years. So instead of speaking, I just nodded. A single, small, jerky movement that felt like the most significant gesture of my entire life. A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over his face. He leaned in, and the agonizing slowness of his movement was a testament to the weight of the moment. This was not an act of passion, but of discovery. It was a confession. His lips met mine, and they were soft, hesitant, and searching. It was a question in itself. Is this real? Are you here with me? It was tentative and chaste, a simple press of mouths, yet it was the most earth-shattering thing I had ever experienced. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock I had long since believed was rusted shut. It was the feeling of a door, one I had been staring at for years, finally swinging open. And in the quiet, rain-soaked darkness, I felt myself stepping through it, into a new and terrifyingly beautiful world. The kiss ended as gently as it began. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his forehead resting against mine. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shaky. In the immediate aftermath, there was a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity. It was a silence filled not with tension, but with a fragile, shimmering peace. We had crossed the line. The unspoken had been spoken, not with words, but with an act of such profound vulnerability that it had rewritten the entire history of our friendship. I brought a hand up to cup his cheek, my thumb stroking his skin. He leaned into my touch, a soft, contented sigh escaping his lips. For a single, perfect minute, everything was right. The world made sense. Then I saw it. A flicker. He opened his eyes, and the peace was gone, replaced by a dawning, wide-eyed panic. It was as if the reality of what he had just done came crashing down on him all at once. The unknowing initiator had finally become knowing, and the knowledge terrified him. He pulled away from me, scrambling to a sitting position on the other end of the couch, creating a chasm of space where moments before there had been none. He ran a hand through his hair, his movements jerky and agitated. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the blank television screen, his jaw tight. The beautiful, fragile bubble had popped, and the sound it made was deafening. I should go, he stammered, not to me, but to the room at large. Before I could even process what was happening, he was on his feet, grabbing his jacket from the back of the armchair where he'd left it. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, a man escaping the scene of a crime. He didn't even put the jacket on properly. He just slung it over his shoulder and headed for the door. He paused there for a second, his back to me, and I thought he might say something, offer some explanation. But he just shook his head slightly and was gone, the quiet click of the latch echoing in the suddenly cavernous silence of my apartment. I was left alone on the couch, the warmth of his body still lingering on the cushions next to me, the phantom feeling of his lips still on mine. The rain beat against the window, a lonely, mournful rhythm. The clarity was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I had just been given the most beautiful gift of my life, only to have it snatched away in the very next breath. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from him. "Hey, sorry about last night. I had to get to work early for a meeting. It was so painfully casual, so aggressively normal, that it felt like a slap in the face." There was no mention of the kiss, no acknowledgement of the monumental shift that had occurred between us. He was trying to erase it, to pretend it never happened. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. An agonizing, suffocating silence descended. He didn't come over. He answered my texts with short, non-committal replies. The couch sat empty. The spare room door remained firmly, unequivocally closed. He was avoiding me, building a wall of polite distance brick by painful brick. My mind became a torture chamber of self-doubt and recrimination. Had I imagined the tenderness in his eyes? Had I misinterpreted his question? Maybe for him, it was just a moment of lonely confusion, a misguided attempt to fill the void Sarah had left. Maybe he had woken up the next morning filled with regret and disgust. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in my gut. I had allowed myself one moment of pure, unadulterated hope, and the universe had punished me for it. The fear that I had not only misread everything, but had also irrevocably ruined the most important friendship in my life was overwhelming. The quiet observer had finally stepped into the frame, and in doing so, had shattered the entire picture. I felt frustrated, hurt, and profoundly foolish. After a week of this radio silence, I knew I couldn't let it go on. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I needed an answer, even if it was the one that would break my heart completely. I needed to know if I had to mourn the loss of a potential love or the certain death of a friendship. So, with my heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs, I went to his apartment. As I stood outside his door, the same way he had stood outside mine just a week before, the irony was not lost on me. I raised my hand and knocked, the sound echoing my own internal panic. He opened the door after a long moment, and he looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was a mess. He was still in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. He looked surprised to see me, and then a wave of something else, guilt, fear, regret, washed over his face. He didn't invite me in, just stood there blocking the doorway. His apartment was dark behind him, and I could see piles of takeout containers on the counter. He was retreating, hiding. The sight of him so lost and miserable broke through my own hurt. "Liam," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to talk." He flinched at the words, but didn't argue. He just sighed, a long, weary sound, and stepped back to let me in. The apartment was even worse up close. It felt stagnant, neglected. He didn't turn on any lights, so we stood in the gloomy afternoon light filtering through the dirty windows. "What was that?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. "What happened the other night? And what is this? Why are you avoiding me?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the floor, shaking his head. "I can't, Leo. I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" I pressed, a new wave of frustration rising in me. "Sorry for kissing me? Or sorry for running away like a coward afterwards? You can't do that, and then disappear. You owe me an explanation." That finally made him look at me, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate pain. "I don't know," he burst out, his voice cracking. "Okay, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing." He sank onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. And then he broke. The carefully constructed walls he had been hiding behind crumbled, and everything came pouring out. He talked about how lost he'd felt since Sarah left, how my apartment, my presence, had been the only thing that felt real and safe. He talked about the couch, about the comfort he found in just being near me, a comfort he'd never experienced with anyone else, not even her. He admitted that over time, that feeling of comfort had morphed into something else, something deeper and more confusing that he didn't have a name for. "That night," he said, his voice muffled by his hands, "I was looking at you, and it just hit me. I didn't want to go to the spare room. I didn't want to be alone. I wanted to stay there, with you. And not just as a friend. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. It scared the hell out of me, Leo. I've never felt that for a guy before. I didn't know what it meant. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Because I was terrified of what it meant about me, and I was even more terrified of what it might do to us. He finally confessed the truth that had been haunting the space between us. He missed it. He missed me. The silence, the avoidance. It wasn't a rejection of me, but a panicked retreat from his own feelings. He was just as lost and scared as I was. His confession was like a release valve, letting all the toxic pressure of the past week escape the room. The anger and hurt I had been nursing dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound empathy. He wasn't a coward who had played with my feelings. He was a man grappling with a fundamental shift in his own identity, and he was doing it messily and imperfectly, just like any human being would. I crossed the room and sat down next to him on his couch, leaving a small, respectful space between us. He watched me, his expression wary, as if he expected me to yell, or worse, to leave. I've been in love with you for years, Liam. The words came out quietly, simply, without any of the drama or fanfare I had always imagined they would have. They were just a statement of fact, a piece of information I was laying on the table between us. His eyes widened, a look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face. He stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. The idea that my feelings for him weren't a new, situational development, but a long-standing, foundational part of who I was seemed to completely short-circuit his brain. He opened his mouth, then closed it, utterly speechless. I never said anything. I continued, my gaze steady on his, because our friendship was the most important thing in the world to me. It still is. I was so afraid of ruining it that I was willing to live with the secret forever. When you started staying with me, when we started with the couch, I thought I was going to lose my mind. I wanted it so badly, but I kept telling myself it was just in my head, that you were just grieving and needed a friend. I took a deep breath. That night, when you asked if you could kiss me, you have no idea what that did to me. It wasn't a moment of confusion, Liam. For me, it was the answer to a prayer I was too afraid to even whisper. We sat there in the dim light of his neglected apartment, our truths finally laid bare between us. There were no more secrets, no more ambiguity. Just two people, scared and confused, but finally on the same page. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between us for a moment before he gently took mine. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet. It was an anchor, a connection. I don't know what this means, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know who I am right now. That's okay, I said, squeezing his hand. We can figure it out. Together. That conversation was the beginning of our new foundation. It wasn't a magical fix. His confusion didn't just disappear, and my years of guarded self-protection didn't just melt away. But the fear was different now. It was a shared fear, a challenge we were facing as a team instead of as two isolated individuals. We started to talk, really talk, with a raw honesty that was both terrifying and liberating. He talked about the rigid expectations he had always lived under, the box he had put himself in without ever realizing it. I talked about the loneliness of loving someone in secret, the quiet ache of watching him live a life I couldn't be a part of. We were like two archaeologists, carefully excavating the ruins of our old relationship to see what precious artifacts could be salvaged to build a new one. We decided to take it slow, to let things unfold naturally, without labels or pressure. He started spending time at my apartment again, but it was different. The tentative, questioning nature of his presence was replaced by a quiet intentionality. We were choosing to be in that space together. The first few nights, he slept in the spare room, but this time, he closed the door. It wasn't a rejection, but a sign of respect, a redrawing of boundaries so that we could cross them again, but this time, consciously and together. The resolution, the true beginning of our new normal, came about a week later. We had spent the evening making dinner together, moving around my small kitchen in an easy, comfortable rhythm. After we ate, we ended up on the couch, but we sat at opposite ends, a deliberate, conscious space between us. When it grew late, he stood up and stretched. I watched him, my heart doing a familiar, anxious flutter. He started towards the spare room, and for a second, My stomach dropped with disappointment. But then he stopped in the hallway. He stood there for a long moment, his back to me, the very picture of the man who had stood frozen by my door weeks earlier. But this time, the indecision felt different. It wasn't born of fear, but of choice. He turned around slowly and walked back into the living room. He stopped in front of me and just looked down at me, a small, hesitant smile on his face. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. I looked at his outstretched hand and then up at his face. His eyes were clear, his expression calm and certain. There were no more questions, no more fear. There was only an invitation. I placed my hand in his, and his fingers closed around mine, warm and sure. He led me from the living room, past the spare room with its closed door, and into my bedroom. He let go of my hand to pull back the covers, and we got into bed, the mattress dipping with our combined weight. We lay on our sides, facing each other in the darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city through the window. He didn't try to kiss me or pull me closer. We just lay there, inches apart, looking at each other. The silence was back, but it was a different silence now. It was a peaceful, contented silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. It was the silence of arrival. After a few minutes, he reached across the small space between us and took my hand again, his thumb stroking gently over my knuckles. In that quiet, domestic moment, I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought me to tears. All the years of yearning, of quiet observation, of painful longing, it had all led to this. Not a grand, passionate explosion, but a quiet, steady, and deliberate coming together. It was the profound relief of finding a safe harbor after a long and lonely voyage. It was the feeling of being home. I thought back to that moment he had stood by my door, when time itself seemed to stretch and hold its breath, waiting for a decision. I realize now that some moments stretch not because they are a point of departure, but because they are the beginning of a new kind of time. The time of before, with all its secrets and ambiguities, had finally ended. And the time of after, the quiet, beautiful, honest time of US, was just beginning, measured not in the frantic ticking of a clock, but in the steady, shared rhythm of our breathing in the dark.